I'm breaking down one of the most important aspects of making your own burgers, and that is the grind. Understanding how to grind your own meat can take your burger game to the next level. From choosing the right fat ratio to mastering the grind size, I'm going to take you through everything that you need to know in order to be able to have flavorful and juicy burgers every single time. First up is fat ratio and meat selection. A lot of people tell you that each cut of the cow has its own distinct flavor profile, and a lot of restaurants are going to brag that they have their own custom blend for their burgers. Usually it's just a mix of chuck, brisket, and short ribs for good reason. In reality, I don't think that most people can tell the difference between different grinds when it comes to the meat that goes into it, but what's more important is the fat ratio, and there's some science that goes behind that to get the right ratios given the different recipes that people use. Chuck is a perfect cut for most grinds because it has a good ratio between meat and fat. It's about 80% lean and 20% fat, just naturally in any given cut. So if you could only use one, it would probably be chuck. Short ribs is also super common because it's supposed to have a lot more flavor that comes along with it. It's 30 to 40% fat, so a lot more fat than chuck. And so you would mix this in to raise up the fat profile in your grind. One drawback though is these ones come with the bones, and so it ends up being more expensive per pound. Brisket is also super common, and it is around 20 to 30% fat, and that really just depends on how much of that fat cap that you put in with your grind. That allows you to customize it as well. If you've ever had brisket, you know that it has a lot of beef flavor. So whenever I trim one up to smoke it, I always keep the trimmings for the grind because it makes amazing burgers. Sirloin is also pretty common, but this one is super lean. We're talking more like 93% lean and 7% fat. So this is a good grind for something that you may not want a lot of fat in, say you're making a spaghetti, but if you're making burgers, this one may come out a little bit dry, but we're gonna try that out. I'm gonna use these cuts to make my own custom blends of 70, 80, and 93% lean ground beef, and then I'm gonna grill them up and compare the differences. And for all of these, I cut up the meat and put it in the freezer for 30 minutes to make it easier to grind. For the 70% grind, that's gonna be half chuck and half short ribs. 80% is gonna be all chuck, and that 93% lean is gonna be all sirloin. Now that the three blends are ground up, you can see a pretty significant difference from the super lean sirloin, which is 93% lean over here. Lots of pink, not a lot of white fat. And then it starts to get whiter as you get more and more fat in it. This is the chuck, which is approximately 80%. I'm guessing this one is about 70% with that short rib in there. And so that's how you can make a big difference in your blends. But the question is, which one of these is going to make a better burger? Let's form up those patties and get them out on the grill. I cooked all of the burgers the same way on the same grill and at the same time. And I took each one off when it reached 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a lot of people like their burgers medium, which is pink on the inside. Now, I prefer to take it past that because then you don't have to worry about the foodborne illness, E. coli. But the risk is you can start to dry it out. But if you cook it right, you won't have that problem. And I've done it enough times that I know that these can still be juicy because of the way that they're cooked. Now, one thing that people think about when they look at the different fat contents is shrinkage. And the one that had the most fat is a little bit smaller when it's finally cooked than the other ones. It pulled back more. So if you're making a burger for a bun, you'd need to flatten it out and make it a little wider to still make it fit. And that came through with the weight as well. I weighed each of these before at 150 grams, then I weighed them afterward, and the 70% came in at 80, 85 for the 80%, and then the 93% lean was almost 100 grams, it was 98. So this one lost the least amount of weight overall. With that, let's cut into them and see how they taste. Well, that came out a lot like I would have expected. The 70% was a little bit more moist because of that extra fat content. 80% was still very good, still very moist, but the 93% lean was incredibly dry. The only people who really like to eat this kind of a burger are the ones who are trying to maximize their protein and lower their calories or their fat, so they go with the leaner meat. I prefer the 70% or the 80% lean. If I had to choose though, I'd get the 80% every time. The fat ratio is just one component. Let's check out what happens when you change the grind. When you pick up your meat at the grocery store, you're probably going to get a pretty fine grind, and you're stuck with whatever they've produced. But if you do it on your own, you can customize it to your own liking. And the coarseness of the grind is determined by the holes in the plate in your grinder itself. So the bigger the hole size, the coarser the grind is going to be, the bigger chunks that are going to come out. So this one is a 10 millimeter plate. It's very, very coarse. You might use something like this for chili or breakfast sausage, and we're going to have to see how it comes out for a burger. Now, this one is 4.5 millimeters, so the holes are much, much smaller. So in order to be able to get the meat through, it's gonna have to be cut into smaller pieces, much finer grind. This is still a little bit coarser than what you'd see at the grocery store. So what I'm gonna do is grind up some chuck roast at 4 different coarseness levels. One of them is gonna be 1/8 or about 3 millimeters. We've got 4.5, 6, and the super coarse 10 millimeter plates. So straight out of the grinder, you can see a pretty big difference between the super coarse 10 millimeter grind and the 1/8 or 3 millimeter grind. You've got lots of big chunks over here, and as you go farther down and get smaller pieces, the fat is more evenly distributed, whereas if you do a coarser grind, you've got big chunks along the way. Let's go put these into patties and we'll see how they come out. The different grind burgers are now finished, and one thing that I noticed straight out of the gate is the one that was super coarse was very difficult to cook. Those extra big pieces didn't really stick together very well, and so even before I got it on the grill, it started to fall apart. Cutting into it was a similar story. Let's look at the cross section. Now you can see how that coarseness of the grind played out even after it was cooked. You can see big chunks of meat going back into even smaller, very fine ground meat. Now, one of the things that can impact is the mouthfeel or how much chew it has. So let's give it a taste and see how it turned out. This is the super coarse and the most fine. So the super coarse 10 millimeter burger had a lot of chew in order to be able to get it down, in order to break down those pieces, since the grind didn't do most of the work. Now the 2 finer ones, the 3 and the 4.5, were much smoother, much more tender, and those were both pretty good, but my favorite was the 6 because it has that little bit of a balance between being tender and having a little bit of bite to it, and I prefer just a little bit of bite in my burger. That said, if I was doing a smash burger, 100% I would do the 3 or the 1/8 grind because it comes out super smooth. So when you smash it down onto that griddle, you get more of those lacy bits, which is what you're looking for. If you're gonna grind your own burgers, you're gonna need a grinder, and I've got this buying guide that goes over the 3 main categories of grinders, so that way you can pick which one's gonna work best for your situation.